a similar experience. Some very emotional reaction. Like even me, when I heard I do UBI more than 20 years ago, I wasn't persuaded. Rather, I get angry about the idea. Why? For example, my parents and my mother, my father devote almost their life to feed me and my brother, and they gave up what they really want to do. And I really had been grateful for that, the sacrificing. And the idea of basic income, that means we don't need to sacrifice our dream, our life for making it. And that's kind of bad. In the first of all, I think that it's denying what my father and mother experienced in their life. And those kind of emotion is prevailing. Many people gave up their dream of what they really want to do in order to survive. And yes, that's a strong emotional things. And yes, that I really have to persuade and understand their anxiety and their fear and their emotion, and try to build a bridge to communicate each other, not jumping on to persuasion, rather to share our experience. Yes.
So one last question, and then you can leave us with your final thoughts as well. Is there any pilot program, have there been any experiments of UBI in Japan, and what were the results?
Well, not at all. Well, there are some people who want to do some experiment, including some mayor of small municipality, but like funding and legal conditions and those things so far is a barrier to go forth.
So if you want, we have a couple more minutes, you can give your final thoughts.
Oh yes, well, patriarchy is really prevailing in East Asia, not only Japan. Maybe Japan might be worse, but as far as I know, Taiwan, Korea, China, all of us have some patriarchy, and we need to change that things. And also we have many things common in the all over the world. I might emphasize the difference in Japan because I'm asked the situation in Japan, but even in Japan, if I ask someone how people spend the money when UBI is introduced, it's quite negative. But if I ask people, how will you do when UBI will be introduced? They're quite positive. They start to talk about the dream and what they really want to do. So potential for introduction of UBI is in East Asia, including Japan. So let's make it happen together. Thank you. 谢谢.
Thank you, Toru. 谢谢. Okay, so now we will move on to the next presentation. If you want to go listen to Xu and Inoshmet in 270-101, we will continue with that presentation. It's ongoing, so you can join them in that room. Yeah, so we'll call you up. And I'll get up here. No, it looks like it's. Oh yeah. You did you have your PowerPoint? Yeah. So. So like I said, is still, is providing his presentation, beginning his presentation with Xu now in 270-101, so if you would like to join them, go ahead. And in this room, I have the distinct pleasure of introducing Mr. Gregory Marston. He is Director of the Basic Income Guarantee Program in Australia. He's also the head of School of Social Sciences at the University of Queensland. And today he will talk about the state of UBI in Australia and New Zealand.
现在在这间教室即将演讲的主题是全球无条件基本收入在澳洲与纽西兰的阶段。 由保障澳洲基本收入主任、昆士兰大学社会科学主要人 Gregory Marston 发表演说。
Let's give a round of applause to Mr. Marston.
It's great to be talking about basic income in this part of the world, because anyone who participates in basic income conferences know that we're usually in the northern hemisphere, and it was great in terms of career last year. It's been better to be here in terms of Taiwan this year. So if you asked me to be here 12 months ago, I wouldn't have had very much to say in terms of a report card about Australia. There was some interest, and it's been at the margins, but really in the last 12 to 18 months, both in Australia and New Zealand, it's really kind of heated up. So my kind of question today in part is whether we're going to turn that hot air into action, because there has been a lot of discussion in the media. Think tanks, both from the left, the centre and the right, have got an interest in UBI. Some are saying it's not the idea or a dangerous idea to use the Institute for Public Affairs. Whereas some of the other think tanks in the centre and on the left are certainly getting encouraged about this for a number of reasons. Some of which Toru talked about in terms of automation. I'll discuss that a little bit in terms of what the case is in Australia and what the predictions are in both Australia and New Zealand in terms of the technological unemployment argument. I also think, some of my backgrounds in political science, is how do we frame the question about going forward in terms of connecting with the public and what social movements we bring along with this, I think is really critical, because you can create a lot of resistance in the way in which we communicate. And as politicians know only too well, really most of what we do in politics is about language. Just watch Trump, right? I mean, we might think he's a moron, but in terms of the way in which he's able to connect with ordinary citizens and make those kinds of assertions about making America great again is a kind of narrative. It is a kind of utopian thought. And in our tradition, in terms of social policy, for example, there is a whole way in which we have been engaged in thinking about what sort of society we might construct. And I think it's on that basis about thinking of the good society, the good life, that we should enter those debates, rather than the kind of economic calculus or in terms of the accountant's way, which, how are we going to fund it? Obviously the affordability question is important, but I think that's not the first pitch. But that's where the first questions come always from the audience, as every other speaker has said today. And the moral argument, of course, we have to tackle in terms of creating a bunch of people who can work if we pay them. Just in terms of one point I want to connect with Gary, it's interesting that Gary's doing his PhD at the University of Queensland. I haven't met him. But he was, I think, making an interesting case, and the Commons is one way in which we can fund this, but I think you'd also encounter a lot of resistance, particularly in countries like Australia where private property is so entrenched. So Gary was making the case that tax is the harder way in terms of tax reform, but I would suggest that it's not an easy way either in terms of making improvements on that, particularly when you've got such entrenched private property rights. And there is a very logical tax reform, sound affordability argument you could do in Australia that would easily fund a basic income at around 50% of average weekly earnings, which would be more generous than Gary's $12,000. Because that really doesn't make the difference between labour change in relation to capital. $12,000 is what you get on Newstar, which is our unemployment benefit in Australia. That keeps people employed. It doesn't transform their relationship with capital or their negotiating power in terms of employers. So I don't know how much you know about Australia. I won't dwell on too much, but way too many slides here. New Zealand, both these countries are typically, when you do welfare state typologies, are talking about liberal welfare states. They don't mean that in that kind of sense of believing in fundamental freedoms and human rights. They mean that in the sense that they're often quite lean and quite mean in terms of the social security systems in particular. Australia's got the most targeted welfare system really in the world in terms of it reaching the poorest of the poor. It does administratively, efficiently, very well, right? It's called on that measure, proper social security system. It's not very generous and it's very categorical. So it's very easy to fall into a whole range of poverty traps the moment you start to move into paid work. In New Zealand's very similar in that regard. Most of the Anglophone states, Canada, the US, the UK, have similar types of social security systems. And this is again one of the barriers moving forward with UBI, because this part of our welfare state is absolutely non-universal. Right? And that's what creates some resistance. But we do have weak universal forms of welfare, both in health and education, are very successful, very well accepted national health scheme in the form of Medicare, which everyone pays tax for and reduces health costs. There are issues with it in terms of coverage at the moment, particularly for the Asian population, but we do have some forms of universalism. And once people become attached to those, they're much harder to work. And so another argument around UBI is that the simplicity of it being universal also buys in multiple classes in terms of being support. The moment you say, well, let's not give to the rich because they don't need it, or the middle class, then you really do erode some of the support basically. So I think we have to think about that too in terms of support. Similar story in terms of income inequality. I won't dwell on this, I've got a couple of slides on it. Income inequality is getting better between countries, but worse within countries. And that's particularly true of developed. I won't talk much about work and welfare, except that being on welfare is a full-time job in both these countries. You have to apply for 20 jobs each week, basically, if you're on the unemployment benefit in Australia. If you don't have a job after 6 months, you do 6 months of full-time on the dole, the dole scheme, which is labouring for 4 or 5 days a week, the equivalent of $225. So we put a whole lot of conditions around receiving income support. And we've really turned our social security systems in terms of a participation scheme rather than trying to address poverty, which is what social security was in the 1940s. So we fundamentally changed the policy goals of our social security systems with not much benefit really. The hardest to get into jobs aren't really moving into work, either through these schemes or through the privatised employment services that now exist in our countries that are contracted to non-profits and privates to deliver those services. And they don't do a fantastic job of what the government used to do previously. This is just a little picture about wages growth, and Gary was talking about this morning. Why that's a big issue is because we've also got the most unaffordable housing markets. In the context of Australia, I think it's third in the world, so it's a good race to be in. And it's particularly capital cities, Sydney and Melbourne, for example. In Sydney, the average house price is $1 million. That's what you've got to have. You've got to have, as Gary said, 8 times the income, which is why 2 incomes have to work. And that's why we've got overemployment and underemployment existing at the same time. So people who have full-time jobs are working on average now 35 hours per week, and it's underemployed who want more hours but can't get them. So it's bifurcated labour market. So the whole engine of redistribution in Australia and New Zealand was around work and labour.